start recording. And then, okay, so now we're going to go through chapter 7. It's a little economics, sorry. So let's share. What did I call this? Chapter 7. Must be that one. Okay. So there we have it. Let me blow it up. Okay. So we're talking now about chapter 7. What's the big deal about chapter 7? We're again trying to go more into the details of how you do these CBAs. So last time we talked about how you look at distributional effects. And this time we're going to talk about how to get prices. The problem really becomes, what does the project do to the supply and demand in the community of the output and the inputs? So the first kind of option is that it's a very huge international market. I'm trying to think of grain, for example. The grain price is, we get an international world price. The United States plays a big role in that because we have 5 big grain exporters. So they actually can influence the international price of grain because there's only 5 of them, and we're one of the major exporters of grain. So those 5 companies can have an impact when they do a project. But in general, if you're in a small community and you're going to do something like, say, an irrigation project that's going to help you produce more grain, that's really not going to have a big impact on the price of grain because these are big international markets. Grain markets are very big international markets. The big 5 grain exporters from the US have a lot of power, but again, each individual country is probably not able to change its grain supply and really impact that international price, except possibly the US. If we all started doing one thing, maybe the big 5 would reflect because all the farmers would sell to them and we would have some change. But in the rest of the world, grain is not exported a lot. So if they have a project that increases the supply of grain, or they start buying less grain because they found some other, substitute, they started growing more, I don't know, oats or I don't know, whatever, then probably the price won't be affected because the price is determined in a world market. So each individual community is not going to have a big impact. The second option of, let's say that, oh, we're going to do something, but we're just such a small community that we're just so not exporting, or we're really not impacting anything. We're really not producing enough. Like, for example, in Hawaii, if we do a project in a community to encourage farmers, that is just, we import 85% of the food we eat. So if we have a little bit of increase in the supply of food in a specific community for a specific food, probably not going to have a big effect on the price in the market. Because you can go to the mainland and buy however much you want to when you go into an LA wholesale market. You're not going to impact the price at all. Those markets are so huge and we're buying such a small amount. I mean, the population of this state, the resident population is only 1 million people. Compare that to the population of LA. So we can go over there and buy whatever we want and we're not going to change the price in that market. It's just not a big enough buy. So there's kind of 2 options. One is that this is a big global market, so each individual country does not play an important role, and therefore the community is even a smaller level. So even if we really have a big project at the state or regional level, it's not going to impact it. Or you're in a really small community with a really small project. That's the only 2 options where you're not going to have an impact on prices. So let's again talk about how prices are selected or picked or come from. So again, because we're combining economics with this class, economics, finance, and accounting, the impact of economics is we have this notion that prices are decided in a marketplace. And what happens in the marketplace, the suppliers, the supply comes together as all the suppliers come into the market with their stuff. And you notice as the price goes up, they're willing to supply more because they will supply more labor if you get paid more. You will supply more of everything if you get paid more. And then if you get paid more, you can really go over there and go into other markets and get those resources you need and bring them into this market, because as this thing goes up, you just have that incentive to produce. So you can go and attract resources and pay more for those inputs. And so this actually becomes what we call a marginal cost curve. So as you produce more and more and more, the additional cost of producing more is reflected as you move up the supply curve. And the only thing that really causes you to move up the supply curve is a better price. If you offer me more, I'll do it. If you offer me less, then I'm going to eventually just get out of the market. So that's going to really be reflected in the shape of the supply curve. And that's why it goes upward to the right. We call that the law of supply. And then in the demand curve, again, it's sloping downwards because the consumers will buy more as the price comes down. And there's kind of two reasons why you're going to buy more as the price comes down. The first reason is simply because this thing is cheaper than something else. I can eat apples or I can eat bananas. But if bananas get cheaper, I'm going to probably be more likely to switch away from apples into bananas. So that's really what we call the substitution effect. This good is now decreased in price, therefore I'm more attracted to it and I stop spending my money on this one over here. We call that the substitution effect. And that's really the primary one we're going to talk about. The other option, the other kind of effect that you get is an income effect. So when we have prices go down, we just simply have more money in our wallet to buy more stuff. And some of the stuff we may buy with our money is bananas. Maybe if bananas are cheaper, we switch from apples to bananas, we substitute. And then even if we ate the same, one piece of fruit, one piece of fruit, one piece of fruit, one piece of fruit, and we're eating, as the USDA recommends, I think we're supposed to be eating 4 servings of fruit a day. All your fruit becomes cheaper and you just have more money left over. So you're going to buy more of everything, including maybe an extra banana. Maybe you're going to eat 5 bananas, but maybe you're not. So that's really an income effect. One of the places where you see this probably most marked is more of a negative income effect. If we get more money, do we eat more white rice? If the price of white rice comes down, do we eat more of it? Or do we eat the same amount and take that extra money and spend it on protein or vegetables? So sometimes we do see these effects coming in because we will prefer a different product if we make more money, and sometimes we make more money simply because other things become cheaper. I know it's unusual to think about that because we seldom see prices drop, but occasionally it does happen. I think we're seeing it a lot with electronic goods. My saga about my calculator, my first one cost $100. I think they're practically disposable, aren't they? Like giveaways at events and stuff, calculators. They're on our phones. Like these are becoming so cheap that I would never spend money on a calculator because I have one in my phone. My computer has one. I don't need that anymore. So I wouldn't spend money on those even though they're becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So that's really the type of income effect we'll see, and probably not one that's going to be impacting too much of what you're doing in a benefit cost analysis. It would only impact a cost-benefit analysis if this effect was really big. So mostly we're going to talk about the substitution effect. So as this price comes down, we're going to buy more of it. And as the price comes down, the suppliers will supply less of it. So eventually we're going to have to get to this point in the middle, the magic point of equilibrium. So right here, the last one that we produce cost us exactly the same to produce it as we value it. Everything else before that, right here on this one, we valued it at this much, but it cost us this much. So we should technically keep producing because what we value it is way more than it costs us to produce it. So we end up stopping right here. And that actually becomes the market price. So that's how price is determined. You bring together the demand and the supply. And this is what's going to drive you crazy. Because we want to look at how this thing changes. Well, we really have to be very careful because when we walk into a store, we don't know where the demand curve is and we don't know where the supply curve is. What we see is a price. We don't know where these curves are. And when the price changes, we may not know why. We just know it changed. So all we're observing in our real worlds as we walk around is the price. We don't observe a demand curve. We don't observe a supply curve per se. I don't even think you know what your demand and supply curves are until you walk in and start buying stuff and you're saying, oh, I really like this. It's so cheap. I'll buy two. I know it seems that I act like this is real, but we don't see it. So all we see is a price. But we have to assume that behind that price is some sort of demand and supply curve. And that is what we're really basing our ideas on. If we have a project that actually changes the demand or supply of something, then we have to worry about the benefits or costs associated with that change. And if there is a change in the price, then we're going to assume that there was a change in the supply and the demand brought about by that project. So we have to investigate it further. So the purpose of this chapter is to teach you how to value things. And in general, these will tend to be very large projects. For example, let's say we wanted to build a dam, or we wanted to build a bridge, or we wanted to do training programs. These are very large, expensive projects. And those are the types of things that causes changes in supply and demand curves. Small private investor projects generally will not have this. So if you're working for a business and you're doing a cost benefit for them, often you will not see a change in the position of the supply and demand curve because this one little firm doesn't effectively result in a change in the market price. They can do whatever they want, particularly farmers, and sell it all at the same price. So we're not going to see, they're just such a small piece of it, we're not seeing that. So most of the projects we'll be talking about will be larger government projects that are big enough to really alter the shape and position of these curves. So what types of changes would we see? Well, if the product changes supply or demand, then it will cause a change in output price. What this means is the whole curve changes its position. You're not moving up and down. If you're moving up and down, you're just going up and down a demand curve. What causes you to move up and down a demand curve? A change in price. If I tell you, oh, the price went from here to here, I can say, oh, this is how much more you're willing and able to buy. Willing and able, but you may not buy it yet because you haven't got to the market. This is just what you're willing and able to buy. I have this money. I'm getting in my car, I'm heading to the market, this is my shopping list. How many apples and oranges I buy depends on what those prices are when I get there. So I'm going in, I know how much I'll spend for an apple, I know how much I'll spend for a banana, but I don't know quite what's there until I meet those suppliers and see what they have to offer and what their cost structures are, which is reflected in their supply curves. So I'm out in my car, heading out, and I really don't know what I'm gonna get until I get there. But in this case, if we actually change the position of supply and demand, then we would have a different distribution effect, right? Because the suppliers and the demanders would get different situations. And that is really measured by a change in consumer surplus. That's how we measure those effects, right? That net benefit or net cost that we're trying to plug into our little formula. That's what we're trying to figure out. So we did something, it increased the supply of apples. What's going to be the value of that increase in the supply of apples? We have to translate it from tons of apples to some sort of net benefit or net cost. So that's what we're trying to do here. How do we do that? Because we're always going to be doing projects that change markets. And it changes markets by either changing the position of the supply and demand curve, or we're changing the input price. For example, let's say we have very expensive water, and I mean, we do have a city in Chennai, maybe, in India, is totally running out of water, millions of people, blah, blah, blah. It happened in South Africa recently, in Cape Town, running out of water. Horrible, horrible, horrible. So that's gonna, we may have projects would change an input price. Let's say water was really expensive, so we decided we were gonna do a water project, and we were gonna get access to some deep water under the earth, groundwater, not surface water. We've been relying on surface water, but we're going to drill down and get groundwater. So that could be a very expensive project, but once it's done, it's going to change the prices of water. And water is used in inputs in a lot of things, and that will, in essence, change the position of the supply curves. So again, input price changes result in a change generally in the supply curve. So this analysis will work for either one. It's just you have to know that when you change input prices, you're going to change the position of the supply curve. If inputs become more expensive, supply is reduced because every single one costs us more to produce. If inputs become cheaper, every single one costs us less to produce, and supply is actually increased. So again, we need to look at these consumer and producer surpluses, because that's really just a distributional thing, like how much goes to the consumers and how much goes to the producers. Because when these curves change, those things change. So let's review what a consumer surplus is. So when price is up here at the green line, then you go over here. If that was price, we would want to buy, be willing and able to buy this many, right? So if you buy that many, if you show up, you buy them, okay? Anything above here is really a consumer surplus, because everybody here was willing to pay more, but they got it for this price because every one of them sells for this price. You cannot, what we call, price discriminate. Every apple sells for the same price once you walk in the store. You don't get to pick one and it becomes cheaper the more you buy. You go into the store, there's one posted price for apples, and you decide how many you're gonna buy. So if you were willing to pay a lot more, but you get there and they're cheap, you get a lot of consumer surplus. You really got a lot of value out of that, right? So that's how we measure. This is really the net benefit of having the price there. And if for some reason we did something that caused prices to drop, like say we reduced the cost of inputs because we did our little water project and now apples are cheaper to produce, then the price of apples would go down to here. And what would we have? We would have a bunch of consumers that are much, much better off, because now all these people from here to here were willing to pay more, but they can get it at this price. So the consumer surplus changed from being up here, being in this position. Let me try and get a line. So from being up here, right? So that was the green one. Now we're changing because we've got a cheaper price. So we have a lot more people benefiting. And we'll mark that with the blue. So then the consumer surplus is much, much bigger because it's all this area extending above there. So when you have that situation, then you see consumers are much better off with lower prices because they get more surplus. They get a lot of value that they were willing and able to pay for, but now they don't have to because this thing is simply cheaper. And we have had a food policy in the US that we liked very cheap food. We had this policy because this was a nation, forgive me for the indigenous people being overridden by these newcomers, but ever since they started settling the North America, we kind of welcomed these immigrants. This is the hallmark of Lady Liberty with her torch, welcoming the cold, the tired, and the hungry to our shores. We brought them in. A lot of them were starving. They had no opportunities. So what we wanted to do was populate North America That's why we never had really any immigration limits till the 1920s, 1930s. So this is a relatively new phenomena for us. We were the melting pot of the world. We said we welcomed people from all over the world. We still feel that way, many of us. So we actually had a cheap food policy because we were bringing in all these people trying to populate these large amounts of acreage, because somehow we didn't think the people already living there were enough, I guess. I don't know. They wanted to do development or something. So we brought in all these immigrants and we had a cheap food policy. And we did everything we could to promote cheap food because that was good for consumers. It attracted immigrants. It attracted consumers. That's what it did. So for many years, you will see a lot of a preoccupation with cheap food. So that was the idea, that this net benefit was really good. So that's what a consumer surplus is. And the producer surplus is really the area underneath here. So in this case, it would be this. Oh, no, I need to get my line. In this case, it would be this area under here. So it would be the area underneath. So suppliers are only getting from the price down. So some of them may be willing to supply at a price that's below this price. Those people will, in fact, get a surplus. Everyone who's above this price will not supply, so they won't show up in the market. So remembering now what consumer surplus and producer surplus, which is kind of the bottom half of consumer surplus, looks like. So let's just talk about how we do this. So let's say we did something that caused an increase in demand. We had a big company come in and they hired a bunch of laborers. So there was a big increase in demand. So what impact does that have on the market? Well, demand increases, right? So when that happens, equilibrium goes up to here. And in fact, that is something that produces a net benefit for suppliers, because if you notice, the consumer surplus, in fact, gets smaller because it was starting here at the blue line, and now it starts above here. So this difference between the red and the green and the blue line is, in fact, what used to go to consumers is now going to suppliers. So when you have an increase in demand for labor, it benefits those supplying labor. They get a more consumer or more producer surplus. And the difference really, rather than consumer surplus being here, here to here, consumer surplus is now from here to here. So there may be some compensation because we're now shifted out. We have a bigger willingness to pay for every amount of this thing because demand increased. So that may offset this loss because we're losing this distance, this little area right here, right? We're losing that, but we're gaining this parallelogram sort of thing right here. So how that weighs out really depends on the position of these curves. But clearly, consumer surplus sections are lost because this is really producing more surplus for the suppliers, not for the consumers. How does that look? Okay, so the consumer surplus is above, the producer surplus is below. So you know we used to be here, this area underneath the price line, and above the supply curve is the producer surplus. And now it has basically increased by this area right here. All this area that used to go to consumers now goes to producers. So they are happier. And that's really what but you notice this is a net off, right? It goes from the consumer to the supplier, from the supplier to the consumer, right? One way or the other. So it's a distributional thing. All in all, it's not really changing much of anything because, you know, it's just a redistribution. So that's what that looks like. So now let's look at a supply increase. So if supply increased, then the curve is shifting out this way, and that really benefits consumers because the consumer surplus used to be above the blue line, and now it's above the green line. So you really see a big increase here. That is a big increase now going to consumers because they have a lower price. They're much happier. People that used to be willing to pay this much now only have to pay this much. People that used to be willing to pay this much now only have to pay this much. So everybody in the demand side that was able to buy before is happier, and we get new buying going on because we have more being purchased as we move from this to this. So everybody's happier. Unfortunately, suppliers are not really happier because this producer surplus went down, right? Because it used to be under this blue line and now it's under the green line. So they really lost this amount to consumers. Again, the zero sum. I give it up and you get it. You give it up, I get it. So we're just trading around, and it's a distributional thing. So this only has a big impact when the supplier lives out of the community. Then you actually have to do a little bit more worrying about it, because when the supplier benefits, it's leaving the community if they're a foreign firm. If they're a domestic firm, it just circles around between consumers and producers, and it's just distributional. So we'll really need to think about that. And this really become working with a group that wants to increase local food production. I keep telling to them, look, I understand what you're saying. You want to give more to agricultural workers, to agricultural producers, right? So that we have more local food. They need to get more money or they're not going to be able to produce more food, right? We want to replace imports. Well, that's nice when suppliers get more money, but that will come at a cost for consumers. When they have to switch to a more expensive food, their consumer surplus will be reduced. Whether you like it or not, you're redistributing benefits. So for people that are poor, that eat at fast food places, because for them that's cost effective, they will probably be the first group that starts to suffer. I'm not saying that it wouldn't be better if they ate at home. I'm simply saying that the bulk of the people that are frequenting fast food places are generally not the people with the ability to afford a more expensive food supply. So that is a distributional effect that I warn people, this is what's going to happen. It's the same with increasing the minimum wage. You increase the minimum wage, restaurants that are really not high-end restaurants will tend to go out, but these are restaurants that are generally for the people who have lower incomes. So those marginal low-cost restaurants will go out and we'll be left with all these high-end restaurants. So you're going to see an impact of this type of stuff. Even though it seems like a good idea at the time, when you do the cost and benefits of minimum wage, you have to think about all these distributional effects, because this is going to make a difference. Do we really want only high-end restaurants? Is that what we're searching for? And remember, with that comes the loss of jobs for those people working in the low-end restaurants. Is that what we wanted? Because we got to think about it, and we can't ignore it. Maybe that is what we want. As I tell people, if you really want local food and want to do this, that's fine with me, but be clear that you understand what you're going to end up with. No one is really going to be able to afford to eat out unless you have a lot of money, because the food's going to get really expensive. When you start paying food workers more money, then you're going to have this restaurant effect where you end up with high-end restaurants. And that means that food is going to take a bigger bite out of our budgets. And if we're poor, that is going to have an impact on us. So that's what it's going to be. So if you think that that's going to make everybody richer, it's going to make one group richer and one group poorer. And that's what we have to kind of sort through. So that's really what we're trying to do. Now, another option, remember me talking about, oh, well, what if if an input cost went down? There's two reasons that maybe we had a supply curve shift. One may be that inputs got cheaper. We did this little water project, cost of water went down, supply increased, farmers could produce more. But it may also be, as we've talked about before, that you had a project that really resulted in someone out of the state being now able to ship in because we built a new road, or we built a ferry, or we added a rail line so you can move your stuff from your community into my community so we can get more imports. In that case, you didn't have a reduction in cost. That's not why the supply curve increased. But what you had was an increase in the number of suppliers. So in that case, there are occasions where supply increases, but it's not a result of a decrease in cost of input costs. Most of us make assumption. When we go into the supermarket and the price goes up, we tell our little selves, oh, the price went up because costs went up. Doesn't have to be the case. No, 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 no. Doesn't have to be the case. We're conditioned to think it is the case, and often it is, but just because price goes up, it doesn't always reflect an increase in the inputs. We just think it does because we think everybody functions like that, but it doesn't have to be. Okay, so that's kind of what we're looking at. So let's look at some examples. So you saw what I did. When I had a change in the price, I kind of tried to figure out, well, was it because supply shifted or demand shifted? And if it did, what happened to consumer and producer surplus? And I kept trying to point out these little differences here, like this area right here is what suppliers gave up when this supply increased. That's what they lost. And that then went to consumers. So if that's the case, it's a distributional effect if everybody lives in the community. If it's not everybody living in the community, then it's actually leaking out, and you would not show it as a benefit to the referent group. You would show it as a leak out to that private supply owner who lives out of state or out of the country or, you know, out of the referent group. So that's really what we're looking at. So let's just kind of look at some examples here. Oh, this is what I just said, right? Decrease in cost. If a fall in price results in a decrease in cost, the decrease is a net benefit, which is included in the efficiency net benefits, right? So again, if it's a decrease in cost, then you're really producing a benefit. Things are cheaper. That's kind of helping all of us. And it shows up in efficiency that, oh, we're now making things more efficiently because we have a decrease in cost. So that also shows up as efficiency net benefit. If in fact, all it is a decrease in cost. However, if it isn't, my issue is if a fall in price does not represent a fall in cost, one group is better off, the consumers, and one group is worse off. So again, it's a transfer, and it doesn't really show up in efficiency benefit cost analysis because it nets out. It's only a concern when you do referent group analysis, distributional effects, and what goes to the export, to the foreign firm that owns the project, if there is one. So that's kind of what we're doing. If a fall in product, okay, so if there's not a decrease in price, so here's really the referent group. If the private firm is not a member of the referent group, then efficiency net benefits fall, but it all falls on the shoulders of the foreign firm, right? It's all the foreign firm, because we didn't get a decrease in production cost, but it's the foreign firm that caused the price to go down, and so they bear the whole brunt. It doesn't affect us, it only affects them. So that's kind of how you handle that. However, if they're a member of the referent group, then if the private firm is a member of the referent group, then that loss in net benefits does affect the community because there was a real loss by one member. So that then travels around. Now, again, we're talking about this compensation thing. Is the loss to the consumers equal to the benefit to producers? So again, are there gainers and losers? We talked a lot about this. So you're going to try and really sort through. You're not really, the homework is pretty easy, so you don't really sort through much of this. But if you were really doing this, you might actually have to look at, well, who's the winners and who's the losers, and where are they, and how much did they lose, and is it a better situation? Because if you're doing a government project, what you want to do is make everybody better off. So you want a Pareto improvement. And if you don't have a Pareto improvement, then maybe you shouldn't do this project. So you're really searching. Remember, it's a distributional thing. So that implies we're looking for social welfare. It's a government project. So we're really trying to say, well, you know, how much do you lose? How much do you gain? Could we compensate either through a government rebate program for the losers, or taxing the winners and making sure that that goes to the losers, or something like that, to resolve the, again, just the distributional effects, which is what we talked about last time, which is why we're talking about this. So let's kind of get started here on some examples, because this is where the rubber hits the road. Let's say you build a bridge. You build a bridge. So you're reducing the cost of trips to leave a community, because before we had to go driving all around. So we didn't drive around as much because it was a really long way and it was really expensive. So we decided to build a bridge. So what it did is reduce the cost of traveling from P0 here to P1 here. And we then will take more trips because it's cheaper, because we don't have to drive so far, right? So it's cheaper to take a trip to get out. So what's really the benefit of that? So here's where we were before. The consumer surplus was up here, and now it's up here. So what is the net benefit of building this bridge to our residents? It is this area right here, down here, back here, and up. So it's this rectangle plus this triangle. So what you've got to do is get the area of those two things and add them up, and that will tell you the net benefit to that community of building that bridge. So this would be PA, so that would be measured by this amount of quantity and the difference in those two prices. If you multiply that together, that will give you whatever that price difference was. Say it was 10 cents times all these that you used to sell at a higher price. That is the area of that rectangle. And then you need the area of this triangle. So you figure out what's the difference between these two quantities, and the price differential is the same as it was before. And then you multiply it by 0.5, because you're only getting half the area. And those two areas alone, if you sum them up, will give you a net benefit. So in your problems and homework, or your homework assignments or your assignments, this is easy to figure out because we give you all this data, so you can just sit and get these two areas and add them up. Pretty easy. But in real life, you're going to have to actually estimate this demand curve. That's the kicker, is estimating the demand curve. So in class, it works smoothly because we give you all this data. But in real life, you've got to estimate these demand curves. And that's the killer, because that's where you get the data to compute these two areas that are the net benefits to the residents of this project in their community. But if you were building a bridge and you were in the government, this is how you would be arguing the benefits of the bridge. That we're building it for the welfare of our citizens, and this is all the benefits that accrue to this group of using the money like this, or we could build something else and we could figure out the net benefits of that in a similar way. And I think there is a bridge project on your assignment, which is why we're talking about it. So let's just look at a few other things, because we have so many government projects that everybody wants to do. It's just a never-ending slew of them. So let's look, for example, at subsidizing bus fares. Let's say that this is the cost of providing these fares. This is what it costs the city to have bus fare, to give bus rides. But we think that this should go to the poor, so we come up with the idea that, oh, all these people in a certain area should get this reduced bus fare. So we're going to subsidize bus fares for some or all of our people. So what does that do? Again, it increases the consumer surplus. So here's the increase in consumer surplus. This area right here, and this little area right here. Right? But what is really the cost of this? Because remember I said we didn't change the cost. We just sold more. But now what's happening? We have an increase in consumer surplus, but we haven't really figured out that's a benefit for consumers. But in this case, we actually have a cost, and that is really the cost of supplying these bus fares, right? Because here's the total cost right here of supplying these. And all we're going to get is this in order to cover those costs. So this rectangle right here is in fact the cost of this subsidy. So when we have, this is really a distorting subsidy. It's costing us, and we got to pay it. The government will pay it, and the community will benefit. It will, of course, as we see, it looks like that this cost in this rectangle is probably less than the consumer benefit. So there'll still probably be a net benefit of the project. It's very clear that it's kind of an opportunity cost benefit, but it's a hard money cost for the government, that we got to cough this up. We have this with our own bus. Sometimes we get a little upset because bus fares keep rising, but it's expensive. So if they don't increase them, then we'll have a situation where are people riding the bus more and more as we continue to let them be cheap? And I don't know that that's true. Most people that ride the bus regularly buy a bus pass. They're not doing daily fees. So if you increase daily fees, you're getting it out of people that probably can and will pay it. And there's no reason for us to subsidize that. So maybe we can do our subsidies through the bus passes, which are residents who ride the bus a lot, and the one-time fares go to the people who don't ride the bus as much and can afford to pay the one-time fare, and the cost is reduced. But these are the types of things you'll be talking about in your BCAs as you look for these areas and what does this really costing. Most people think that government programs don't cost us anything, but they really do, because if we don't do this program, we're giving up that program. So we need to understand that we do need to look at the net benefits, which includes all costs of these projects, such as bus subsidies. So there we have it. Let's just look at another thing which I bring up all the time, worker training. So if you train people, right? Remember me saying, oh, we need to get them out of these minimum wage jobs and into higher end jobs by training. So we train them so they can move away from this job into a better job. When you do that, you've increased the supply. So right here, we went from this supply to this supply because we had a job training program. So in this market, our job training program resulted in a lower wage. Yes, it did. Which is one of the reasons why people in high-end labor markets try to restrict supply, because if you train people and you bring them in, then you'll make less money. This is why we have the American Bar Association to restrict the supply of lawyers, the American Medical Association to restrict the supply of doctors, because they know that if we get more doctors, it's going to lower our wage rate. If we get more lawyers, it's going to lower our wage rate. And what's the worst one in the place? Supply of veterinaries. Veterinary programs are very scarce. They don't take a lot of people, and they are very effective at controlling supply of vets. I think they want to be, because vets are not well paid now. And so you get even more of them, they're going to make even less. Vets are one of the lowest paying profession. It tends to be dominated by women. They don't make a lot of money. And I think that's why they're not building more vet schools. Because why increase the supply so you have even cheaper vet services? Med schools, law schools, we've increased those, and these have basically resulted in a decrease in the wages for lawyers and doctors, because we increased the supply through the years by increasing the number of programs. But the American Medical Association and the American Bar Association carefully restrict the number of new lawyers that are admitted to the bar, and this is why they do it. Because we have realized that those are good jobs. We have increased the supply through training programs, and now they're making less money. So this is what we have. So again, what are the costs? What are the benefits? So there is, in fact, an increase in consumer surplus. It was here, and now it increased by this rectangle plus triangle thing. So that's the increase in benefits, and the cost is, again, this drop, right? Because we used to be making this much consumer surplus, right? We used to be this area right here, and now we make this, but maybe it still works, because if you look at these areas, we lost this, but we gained this, right? Because we got more sales. So it might net out. It's hard to say. That's why you need to actually get these graphs up there, get the data up there, and try to actually mathematically figure out the size of these areas. And that's what makes this such a bear, if you're not in class with me, is that you actually have to go measure these supply and demand curves. Super big work. Again, though, if it's just a private investor with a small project, you're not going to see a lot of this shifting in these demand and supply curves. Where it's really going to matter is when you're talking about government projects that are big projects that really change supply and demand. And you notice many of my examples: training programs, big projects; bridges, big projects; setting subsidies, big project. All those are big projects. So that's why there's such a, okay, so that we went over that one. Okay, so here's a case where we're trading off between a bridge and a ferry. So then you would have to have two different sets of curves, because you had originally this demand for ferry service, and it's now decreased because you now built a bridge. So I don't want to use the ferry. It takes more time. So this market is going to result in some changes. For example, consumer surplus will change, because here we were like this, and now we're kind of like this. So there's that change. I don't even know if it's going to net out to be positive or negative, because this one goes out further. So this area might, in fact, be bigger than this one. That's what I'm thinking. So a loss in consumer surplus in this market. And producers also lose in this market. The ferry is not going to do as well. They're just going to be simply less producer surplus. And that is all going to shift over here to the bridge market, because the bridge market is now going to have these benefits and these benefits to this producer and this consumer. So if this was a private company, a ferry trip company, a ferry, then they may be losing some private benefits, but it ends up over here being government benefits, because the government operates the bridge, for example. So maybe they charge tolls and they make money, or they don't charge tolls. And so that gets to be a taxpayer-funded thing, which is very expensive as compared to letting a private supplier supply it, which is what was going on with the ferries. So again, all distributional. All distributional. And who really ultimately wins in this one? The consumers using the bridge. Ferry customers don't really benefit much. Maybe it's a little cheaper, yeah, because price went down. So it's a little cheaper. So they benefit there. And maybe it's less crowded, so they get moved in and out faster. I'm not sure. The ones that remain. But the people with the bridge really benefit a lot because you can see that that area is probably the largest because it was 0 and now it's kind of big. So that's kind of how we would look at different trade-offs. And lastly, again, just price levels become an issue. So if you have a real price change, which means the equilibrium price change and quantities change, so you're actually going from here to here, so price went down, quantity went down. Those are real price changes. And so those will generally probably cause quantities to change, and that's when you need to worry about those consumer and producer surpluses. That's why we're worried about them. That's why we pay attention. But if prices do not cause output levels to change, then again, no quantities change, we don't worry about it, and you're just looking at more distributional stuff. Right? That's all you're looking at. You're not even questioning what it is, you're just moving right to it, right? How it, you know it has to net out. Okay. And then there's something in your book called the Calder-Hicks criteria. If the price goes down, you may buy the exact same amount. I just get it cheaper. So some of your consumers will be doing that. That's what you also have to worry about with some of these demand and supply curves. I'm not really talking about how the demand is distributed. You may have one family buying all of this, and I just buy one every week. I buy my little head of cabbage. If the price goes down, I get a windfall. If the price goes up, I don't. I am not going to buy more. I'm not going to buy less. I'm just going to buy my one head of cabbage every week. That's what I eat in a week. One head of red cabbage, that's what I buy. I know how to get it most cost effectively. I go to my little farmer market and I buy it. That's what I do. Every Sunday, there I am. But buy that head of lettuce. I don't even pay attention to the price. I just want one. So for me, if the price goes up, I lose. If the price comes down, I get a windfall. So again, there's some people in the community, that's what makes this so hard. It's not equally distributed. And this is another thing that will come up, is certain consumer groups like poor people will be unequally hurt by the change in the price of food and gas and rent, because those people are spending all their money on basic necessities. So they will be unequally hurt compared to people that are not spending all their money on that. They can absorb an increase in the price of food and increase in the rent. So this is kind of an issue that you will also be worrying about, because we're getting more and more into these distributional effects. This is crucial when we're doing sustainability work. Okay, so again, mostly we're assuming that this income effect, and we, of course, economists have our little words, that's called the Marshallian demand curve, where you've got income and substitution effects. Mostly we're going to deal with Hicksian, where we're going to assume that there's just not a lot of income effect, just because in reality, with the work we're doing, we're isolating on one market, there is not usually such a huge income effect. To really have an income effect, you have to have a significant drop. For example, when the price of homes crashed, that had a significant impact, right? Because they came down very, very dramatically. So people that maybe couldn't buy before could buy, and people who wanted to sell their homes and get into another home couldn't do anything because they were kind of underwater. The price has just gotten. So they were very unreally hurt, and people that were not already owning a home were not hurt at all. So that income effect was very large because it's a big ticket item, and there was a major price drop. I mean, the house was just worth $200,000 less. So are you upset about that? Well, I personally wasn't upset because I wasn't buying or selling, so I'm not realizing those losses. But anybody who was buying and selling, big problem. So anyway, that's where we are. That is chapter 7. I know it's a little complicated, but the problems are very simple. And so you can go right to them. There will be examples for each one you can find in your book. We went through the bridge one, I know is there. We went through it. I can't remember, maybe one is a minimum wage or attracting somebody from another market. They're pretty simple, so you shouldn't have any problems with them. I think there's only 3 problems assigned. It seems a little more complicated here, but what you're really doing is looking at how those markets reflect what happened as a result of the project. Any questions? No.
Nope, no questions.
Okay, so should go pretty good. So I'm going to stop sharing, end the meeting, and again, I'm going to post, and then this will be up there. And because we're only getting now assignments from the questions at the end of the chapters, exercises at the end of the chapter, those questions, it should be getting pretty easy. And you also may be able to switch away from Excel, maybe not if you have to draw a graph or something, or you need to multiply or something, but it's going to become significantly quicker to get through these homeworks because we're not laying out these big NPVs anymore. We're simply trying to hone in on specific elements of an NPV so that we can figure out exactly what's going on relative to that specific issue. And so from here on in, a lot of it has to do with supply and demand and where is it, who's doing what, and blah, blah, blah. So it's mostly focused on economics from here on out because that's really the most difficult thing to do. The accounting and the finance stuff, in my personal opinion, accounting and finance are much, much easier to deal with because it's very easy to get the data. Finance, very easy to use the NPV formula, very easy to try out different interest rates. You know, it's much more straightforward. Accounting is very set principles. They do it always the same way. So it's much easier. A lot of it's controlled by the government. So it's much, much easier to figure out the benefits and costs in finance and accounting than it is when you start actually looking at the impacts in markets, because you got to worry about these curves, which, do we really know where those things are? Let me just tell you, years you can worry about where these curves are. So, and then you actually have specialty areas, like some people only estimate supply curves. Some people only work in demand or certain types of demand. Demand for food. I know economists that spend 20 years just talking about the demand for food and estimating demand curves for food. Very, very intensive work. So that's kind of where we're at. And if no questions, then we'll end the lecture and I'll get the PowerPoint up. Okay. Bye, everybody.
Thanks. Have a good day.